Continuing Flamininus from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Titus, having detached this party, lay quiet with his main body, merely keeping up the attention of the enemy by some slight skirmishing. But when the day arrived that those who stole round were expected upon the top of the hill, he drew up his forces early in the morning, as well the light-armed as the heavy, and, dividing them into 3 parts, himself led the van, marching his men up the narrow passage along the bank, darted at by the Macedonians, and engaging in this difficult ground, hand to hand with his assailants, whilst the other 2 divisions on either side of him threw themselves with great alacrity among the rocks. Whilst they were struggling forward, the sun rose, and a thin smoke, like a mist, hanging in the hills, was seen at a distance, unperceived by the enemy, being behind them as they stood on the heights. And the Romans also, as yet, utter suspense, in the toil and difficulty they were in, could only doubtfully construe the sight according to their desires. But as it grew thicker and thicker, blackening the air, and mounting to a greater height, they no longer doubted, but it was the fire signal of their companions, and, raising a triumphant shout, forcing their way onwards, they drove the enemy back into the roughest ground, while the other party echoed back their acclamations from the top of the mountain. The Macedonians fled with all the speed they could make. There fell, indeed, not more than 2,000 of them, for the difficulties of the place rescued them from pursuit. But the Romans pillaged their camp, seized upon their money and slaves, and, becoming absolute masters of the pass, traversed all Epirus, and with such order and discipline, with such temperance and moderation, that, though they were far from the city, at a great distance from their vessels, and stinted of their monthly allowance of corn, they don't mean what we mean when we say corn, they mean grain. And, though they had much difficulty in buying, they nevertheless abstained altogether from plundering the country, which had provision enough of all sorts in it. And, I automatically changed the word for donkey, too, so, well, we haven't encountered donkey in this chapter, but you know what I mean. For intelligence being received that Philip, making a flight rather than a march through Thessaly, forced the inhabitants from the towns to take shelter in the mountains, burnt down the towns themselves, and gave up as spoil to his soldiers all the property which it had been found impossible to remove. Abandoning, as it would seem, the whole country to the Romans, Titus was therefore very desirous, and entreated his soldiers that they would pass through it as if it were their own, or as if a place trusted into their hands. And indeed they quickly perceived by the event what benefit they derived from this moderate and orderly conduct, for they no sooner set foot in Thessaly, but the cities opened their gates, and the Greeks within the Thermopylae were all eagerness and excitement to ally themselves with them. The Achaeans abandoned their alliance with Philip, and voted to join with the Romans in actual arms against him, and the Apuntians, though the Aetolians, who were zealous allies of the Romans, were willing and desirous to undertake the protection of the city, would not listen to proposals from them, but, sending for Titus, entrusted and committed themselves to his charge. It is told of Plutarch that when first from an adjacent hill or watchtower, which gave him a prospect of the Roman army. He described them drawn up in order. He observed that he saw nothing but barbarian-like. He saw nothing barbarian-like in this barbarian line of battle. And all who came near Titus could not choose but say as much of him at the first view, for they who had been told by the Macedonians of an invader at the head of a barbarian army, carrying everywhere slavery and destruction on its sword's point, when, in lieu of such an one, they met a man, in the flower of his age, of a gentle and humane aspect, in Greek, in his voice and language, and a lover of honor, were wonderfully pleased and attracted, and when they left him, they filled the cities, wherever they went, with favorable feelings for him, and with the belief that in him they might find the protector and assertor of their liberties. And when afterwards, on Philip's professing a desire for peace, Titus made a tender to him of peace and friendship, upon the condition that the Greeks be left to their own laws, and that he should withdraw his garrisons, which he refused to comply with. Now after these proposals, the universal belief even of the favorers and partisans of Philip was, that the Romans came not to fight against the Greeks, but for the Greeks against the Macedonians. Accordingly, all the rest of Greece came to peaceable terms with him. But as he marched into Boeotia, without committing the least act of hostility, the nobility and chief men of Thebes came out of their city to meet him, devoted under the influence of Bracellus to the Macedonian alliance, but desirous at the same time to show honor and deference to Titus, as they conceived, in enmity with both parties. Titus received them in the most obliging and courteous manner, but kept going gently on, questioning and inquiring of them, and sometimes entertaining them with narratives of his own, till his soldiers might a little recover from the weariness of their journey. And thus passing on, he and the Thebans came together into their city, not much to their satisfaction, but yet they could not well deny him entrance, as a good number of his men attended him in. Titus, however, now he was within, as if he had not had the city at his mercy, came forward and addressed them, urging them to join the Roman interests. King Attalus followed to the same effect, and he, indeed, trying to play the advocate beyond what it seems his age could bear, was seized in the midst of his speech with a sudden flux or dizziness, and swooned away, and not long after was conveyed by ship into Asia, and died there. The Boeotians joined the Roman alliance. But now, when Philip sent an embassy to Rome, Titus dispatched away agents on his part too, to solicit the Senate, if they should continue to the war, to continue him at his command, or if they determined an end to that he might have the honor of concluding the peace. Having a great passion for distinction, his fear was that if another general were commissioned to carry on the war, the honor even of what was past would be lost to him. And his friends transacted matters so well on his behalf that Philip was unsuccessful in his proposals, and the management of the war was confirmed in his hands. He no sooner received the Senate's determination, but big with hopes, he marched directly into Thessaly to engage Philip, his army consisting of 26,000 men, out of which the Attalians furnished 6,000 foot and 400 horse, The forces of Philip were much about the same number. In this eagerness to encounter, they advanced against each other, till both were near Scotessa, where they resolved to hazard a battle. Nor had the approach of those two formidable armies the effect that might have been supposed to strike into the generals a mutual terror of each other. It rather inspired them with ardor and ambition, on the Romans' part, to be the conquerors of Macedon, a name which Alexander had made famous amongst them for strength and valor, whilst the Macedonians, on the other hand, esteeming of the Romans as an enemy very different from the Persians, hoped, if victory stood on their side, to make the name of Philip more glorious than that of Alexander. Titus, therefore, called upon his soldiers to play the part of valiant men, because they were now to act their parts upon the most illustrious theatre of the world, Greece, and to contend with the bravest antagonists. And Philip, on the other side, commenced a harangue with his men, as usual before an engagement, and to be the better heard, whether it were merely a mischance or the result of unseasonable haste, not observing what he did, he mounted an eminence outside their camp, which proved to be a burying place, and much disturbed by the despondency that seized his army at the unluckiness of the omen, all that day kept in his camp and declined fighting. Now, we see here an implication of what could have been and what kind of was in wanting to make a name of yourself rather than accomplish, can interfere with things being accomplished either by yourself or others. It should be about action itself. But the best action versus handing over to anybody else, even if they're probably going to do better because they're going to get the honor for even what I did. No. Well, the dignity, the spiritual, or character, or whatever. But because some people divide honor as the secular praise and dignity as the supposedly spiritual. But on the morrow, as day came on, after a soft and rainy night, the clouds, changing into a mist, filled all the plain with thick darkness, and a dense foggy air descending, by the time it was full day, from the adjacent mountains into the ground betwixt two camps, concealed them from each other's view. The parties sent out on either side, some for ambuscade, some for discovery, falling in upon one another quickly after they were thus detached, began the fight at what are called the Canas, Cathala, a number of sharp tops of hills that stand close to one another, and have the name from some resemblance in their shape. Now many vicissitudes and changes happening, as they may well be expected in such an uneven field of battle, sometimes hot pursuit and sometimes as rapid as a flight, the generals on both sides kept sending in succors from the main bodies as they saw their men pressed or giving ground, till at length the heavens clearing up let them see what was going on, upon which the whole armies engaged. Philip, who was in the right wing, from the advantage of the higher ground which he had, threw on the Romans the whole weight of his phalanx, with the force which they were unable to sustain. The dense array of spears and the pressure of the compact mass overpowering them, but the king's left wing being broken up by the hilliness of the place. Titus, observing it, and cherishing little or no hopes on that side where his own gave ground, makes in all haste to the other, and there charges in upon the Macedonians, who, in consequence of the inequality and roughness of the ground, could not keep their phalanx entire, nor line their ranks to any great depth, which is the great point of their strength, but were forced to fight man for man under heavy and unwieldy armor, for the Macedonian phalanx is like some single powerful animal, irresistible so long as it is embodied into one, and keeps its order, shield touching shield, all as in a piece. But if it be once broken, not only is the joint force lost, but the individual soldiers also, who composed it, lose each one his own single strength, because of the nature of their armor, and because each of them is strong rather as he makes a part of the whole than in himself. When these were routed, some gave chase to the flyers, others charged the flanks of those Macedonians who were still fighting, so that the conquering wing also was quickly disordered, took to flight, and threw down its arms. There were then slain no less than 8,000, and about 5,000 who were taken prisoners, and the Attalians were blamed as having been the main occasion that Philip himself got safe off. For whilst the Romans were in pursuit, they fell to ravaging and plundering the camp, and did it so completely that when the others returned they found no booty in it. This bred at first hard words, quarrels, and misunderstandings betwixt them, but afterwards they gulled Titus more by ascribing the victory to themselves, and prepossessing the Greeks with reports to that effect, insomuch that poets and people in general, in the songs that were sung or written in honor of the action, still ranked the Attalians foremost. One of the places most current was the following epigram: Naked and tumulus see, O passer-by, the 30,000 men of Thessaly, slain by the Attalians and the Latin band, that came with Titus from Italia's land. Alas for mighty Macedon that day, swift as a roe, King Philip fled away. This was composed by Alacaus in mockery of Philip, exaggerating the number of the slain, however, being everywhere repeated, and by almost everybody. Titus was more nettled at it than Philip. The latter merely retorted upon Alacaus with some elegiac verses of his own. Naked and leafless see, O passer-by, the cross that shall Alacaus crucify. And lest anybody fall into this nonsense, the Romans weren't the only people to crucify. They were far, far from the first. But such little matters. They just, industrialized it, you could say. Well, not quite, but you know what I mean. But such little matters extremely fretted Titus, who was ambitious of a reputation among the Greeks, and he therefore acted in all after occurrences by himself, paying but very slight regard to the Attalians. This offended them in their turn, and when Titus listened to terms of accommodation and admitted an embassy upon the proffers of the Macedonian king, the Attalians made it their business to publish through all the cities of Greece that this was the conclusion of all, that he was sending Philip a peace at a time when it was in his hand to destroy the very roots of the war, and overthrow the power which had first inflicted servitude upon Greece, and whilst with these and the like rumors the Attalians labored to shake the Roman confederates, Philip making overtures of submission of himself and his kingdom to the discretion of Titus and the Romans, put an end to those jealousies, as Titus, by accepting them, did to the war, for he reinstated Philip in his kingdom of Macedon, but made it a condition that he should quit Greece, and he should pay 1,000 talents. He took from him also all his shipping, save 10 vessels, and sent away Demetrius, one of his sons, hostage to Rome, improving his opportunity to the best advantage, and taking wise precautions for the future. For Hannibal the African, a professed enemy of the Roman name, an exile from his own country, and not long since arrived at King Antiochus's court, was already stimulating that prince not to be wanting to the good fortune that had been hitherto so propitious to his affairs, the magnitude of his success having gained him the surname of the Great. And one of the things, the Ethiopia or Ethiopias or Ethiopia was a term meaning burnt-faced. That sub-Saharan, they weren't just brown; they were black-skinned. So the entirety of the rest of Africa was given that name, and he had begun to level his aim at universal monarchy. But above all, he was eager to measure himself with the Romans. Had not, therefore, Titus, upon a principle of prudence and foresight, lent an ear to peace, and had Antiochus found the Romans still at war in Greece with Philip, and had these two, the most powerful and warlike princes of that age, confederated for their common interest against the Roman state, Rome might once more have run no less a risk, and been reduced to no less extremities than she had experienced under Hannibal. But now Titus, opportunely introducing this peace between the wars, dispatching the present danger before the new one had arrived, at once disappointed Antiochus of his first hopes, and Philip of his last. When the 10 commissioners delegated to Titus from the Senate advised him to restore the rest of Greece to their liberty, but that Corinth, Chalcis, and Demetrius should be kept garrisoned for the security against Antiochus. The Attalians, on this, breaking out at loud accusations, agitated all the cities, calling upon Titus to strike off the shackles of Greece. So Philip used to term those 3 cities, and asking the Greeks whether it were not matter of much consolation to them, that though their chains weighed heavier, yet they were now smoother and better polished than formerly, and whether Titus were not deservedly admired by them as their benefactor, who had unshackled the feet of Greece and tied her up by the neck. Titus, vexed and angry at this, made it his request to the Senate, and at last prevailed in it, that the garrisons in these cities should be dismissed, that so the Greeks might be no longer debtors to him for a partial but entire favor. It was now the time of the celebration of the Isthmian games, and the seats around the race course were crowded with an unusual multitude of spectators. Greece, after long wars, having regained not only peace but hopes of liberty, and being able once more to keep holiday in safety, a trumpet sounded to command silence, and the crier, stepping forth amidst the spectators, made proclamation that the Roman Senate and Titus Quintius, the proconsular general, having vanquished King Philip and the Macedonians, restored the Corinthians, Locrians, Phocaeans, Euboeans, Achaeans, of Phthiotis, Magnetians, Thessalians, and Perrhaebians to their own lands, laws, and liberties, remitting all impositions upon them, and withdrawing all garrisons from their cities. At first many heard not at all, and others not distinctly, what was said, but there was a confused and uncertain stir among the assembled people, some wondering, some asking, some calling out to have it proclaimed again. When therefore fresh silence was made, the crier, raising his voice, succeeded in making himself generally heard, and recited the decree again. A shout of joy followed it, so loud that it was heard as far as the sea. The whole assembly rose and stood up. There was no further thought at the entertainment. All were only eager to leap up and salute and address their thanks to the deliverer and champion of Greece. What we often hear alleged in proof of the force of human voices was actually verified upon this occasion. Crows that were accidentally flying over the course fell down dead into it. The destruction of the air must be the cause of it, for the voices being numerous and the acclamation violent, the air breaks with it, and can no longer give support to the birds, but lets them tumble like one that should attempt to walk upon a vacuum, unless we should rather imagine them to fall and die, shot with the noise as a dart. It is possible, too, that there may be a circular agitation of the air which, like marine whirlpools, may have a violent direction of the sort given to it from the excess of its fluctuation. But for Titus, the sports being now quite at an end, so beset was he on every side and by such multitudes, that he had not, foreseeing the probable throng and concourse of the people, timely withdrawn, he would scarce, as is thought, have ever got clear of them, when they had tired themselves with acclamations all about his pavilion, and night was now come. Wherever friends or fellow citizens met, they joyfully saluted and embraced each other, and went home to feast and carouse together, and there, no doubt, redoubling their joy, they began to recollect and talk of the state of Greece, what wars she had incurred in defense of her liberty, and yet was never perhaps mistress of a more settled and grateful one than this which the other men's labors had won for her, almost without one drop of blood or one citizen's loss to be mourned for. She had this day had put into her hands the most glorious of rewards, and best worth the contending for. Courage and wisdom are indeed rarities among men, but of all that is good, a just man, it would seem, is the most scarce, such as Agesilaus, Lysander, Nicias, and Alcibiades knew how to play the general's part, how to manage a war, how to bring off their men victorious by land and sea, but how to employ that success to generous and honest purposes they had not known. For should a man accept the achievement at Marathon, the sea flight at Salamis, the engagements at Plataea and Thermopylae, Chimon's exploits at Eurymedon and on the coasts of Cyprus, Greece fought all her battles against and to enslave herself, she erected all her trophies to her own shame and misery, and was brought to ruin and desolation almost wholly by the guilt and ambition of her Greek men, a foreign people appearing just to retain some embers, as it were, some faint reminders of a common character derived to them from their ancient sires, a nation from whom it was a mere wonder that Greece should reap any benefit by word or thought. These are they who have retrieved Greece from severest dangers and distresses, have rescued her out of the hands of insulting lords and tyrants, and reinstating her in her former liberties. Thus they entertained their tongues and thoughts, whilst Titus by actions made good what had been proclaimed. For he immediately dispatched away Lentulus to Asia, to set the Bargalians free, Titilius to Thrace, to see the garrisons of Philip removed out of the towns and islands there, while Publius Vilius set sail in order to treat with Antiochus about the freedom of the Greeks under him. Titus himself passed on to Chalcis, and, sailing thence to Magnesia, dismantled the garrisons there, and surrendered the government into the people's hands. Shortly after, he was appointed at Argos to preside in the Nemean games, and did his part in the management of that solemnity singularly well, and made the second publication there by the crier of liberty to the Greeks, and visiting all the cities he exhorted them to the practice of obedience to law, of constant justice, and unity and friendship one towards another. He suppressed their factions, brought home their political exiles, and in short, his conquest over the Macedonians did not seem to give him a more lively pleasure than to find himself prevalent in reconciling Greeks with the Greeks, so that their liberty seemed now the least part of the kindness he conferred upon them. The story goes on that when Lycurgus, the orator, had rescued Xenocrates, the philosopher, from the collectors who were hurrying him away to prison for non-payment of the alien tax, and they had them punished for the license they had been guilty of. Xenocrates afterwards, meeting the children of Lycurgus, "My son," said he, "I am nobly repaying your father for his kindness. He has the praises of the whole people in return for it. But the returns which attended Titus, Quintius, and the Romans for their beneficence to the Greeks terminated not in empty praises only, for these proceedings gained them deservedly credit and confidence, and thereby power amongst all nations, for many not only admitted the Roman commanders, but even sent and entreated to be under the protection. Neither was this done by popular governments alone, or by single cities, but kings oppressed by kings cast themselves into these protecting hands, insomuch that in a very short time, though perchance not without divine influence in it, all the world did homage to them. Titus himself thought more highly of his liberation of Greece than of any other of his actions, as appears by the inscription with which he dedicated some silver targets, together with his own shield, to Apollo at Delphi. Ye Spartan Tundarides, twin sons of Jove, who in swift horsemanship have placed your love. Titus of great Aeneas's race leaves this in honor of the liberty of Greece. He offered also to Apollo a golden crown with this inscription: "This golden crown upon thy locks divine, O blessed Latonia's son, was set to shine by the great captain of the unname. O Phoebus grant the noble Titus fame." The same event has twice occurred to the Greeks in the city of Corinth. Titus then, and Nero again in our days, both at Corinth and both alike at the celebration of the Isthmian games, permitted the Greeks to enjoy their own laws and liberty. The former, as has been said, proclaimed it by the crier, but Nero did it in the public meeting place from the tribunal, in a speech which he himself made to the people. This, however, was long after Titus now engaged in a most gallant and just war upon Nabius, that most profligate and lawless tyrant of the Lacedaemonians, but in the end disappointed the expectations of the Greeks, for when he had an opportunity of taking him, he purposely let it slip, and struck up a peace with him, leaving Sparta to bewail an unworthy slavery, whether it were that he feared, if the war should be protracted, Rome would send a new general who might rob him of the glory of it, or that emulation and envy of Philopoemen, who had signalized himself among the Greeks among all other occasions, but in that war especially had done wonders both for matter of courage and counsel, whom the Achaeans magnified in their theatres, and put into the same balance of glory with Titus, touched him to the quick, and that he scorned that an ordinary Arcadian who had commanded in a few encounters upon the confines of his native district should be spoken of in terms of equality with a Roman consul, waging war as the protector of Greece in general. But besides, Titus was not without an apology too, for what he did, namely that he put an end to the war only when he foresaw that the tyrant's destruction must have been attended with the ruin of other Spartans. The Achaeans, by various decrees, did much to show Titus honor. None of these returns, however, seemed to come up to the height of the actions that merited them, unless it were one present they made him, which affected and pleased him beyond all the rest, which was this: the Romans who, in the war with Hannibal, had the misfortune to be taken captives, were sold about here and there, and dispersed in slavery. 1,200 in number were at that time in Greece. The reverse of their fortune always rendered them objects of compassion, but more particularly, as well might be, when they now met, some with their sons, some with their brothers, others with their acquaintance, slaves with their free, and captives with their victorious countrymen. Titus, though deeply concerned on their behalf, yet took none of them from their masters by constraint, but the Achaeans, redeeming them at £5 a man, brought them all together into one place, and made a present of them to him, as he was just going on shipboard, so that he now sailed away with the fullest satisfaction, his generous actions having procured him as generous returns worthy a brave man and a lover of his country. This seemed the most glorious part of all his succeeding triumph, for these redeemed Romans, as is the custom for slaves upon their manumission, to shave their heads and wear felt hats, followed in the procession. To add to the glory of the show, there were Grecian helmets, the Macedonian targets, and long spears borne with the rest of the spoils in public view, besides the vast sums of money. Tuditanus says 3,713 pounds weight of massy gold, 43,270 of silver, 14,000